I want to talk to you this morning about giving your best to Jesus. And I want to give you two pictures to start with to help you evaluate where you are in terms of giving your best to Jesus. The first picture is found in Leviticus 23, and there's this strange thing that God tells His people He wants them to do when they go out and they harvest their grain. It says, when you go out and you harvest, I want you to leave some along the edges of the field so that the poor and the foreigner can come and glean from the edges. So that's one picture, and basically that is a picture of giving someone your leftovers. That's a picture of when you have enough, when you've satisfied your needs, when you've taken care of your family, when you've taken care of your stuff, when you've gotten all that you need, give somebody else the leftovers. The second picture that I want to give to you is also in Leviticus 23, and it's a pattern we find many times in the Old Testament, and it's where God goes to the people and He says, when you're bringing something to me, He basically says He's not content with leftovers. He says, I want you to bring the first fruits. Now, first fruits in our context doesn't mean much, but for them, a first fruit was literally the first portion of whatever they had worked for. So if it was grain, they would be giving the first portion of their grain to God. It was a sacred portion is what God called it. If it was livestock, they would give their firstborn of the livestock to God. And so this picture, over and against the idea of leftovers, is a picture where we are bringing to God our best. So I bring you those two pictures before you today. One is a picture of giving God the leftovers of whatever you have that you don't need, whatever is left at the end of the week, whatever finances you have that you're not using, whatever time you have that you're not using, whatever energy you have that's left over, you can bring that to God. The second picture is where you say, well, I'm not going to do the leftovers. I'm actually going to bring to God the best of what I have. If we're honest and we ask ourselves a question, do we tend to give God the leftovers, or do we tend to give Him the best? I believe this, our default is to say, I'll give God what I have left over. Our default, because it makes more sense. I mean, we know that God doesn't need our best. God in and of Himself is wholly sufficient. So it's not that He needs our best, but yet we find this in the Old Testament. God was never satisfied with His people bringing Him what they had left over. And so it raises the challenge for us in the 21st century, people who live in light of the cross, in light of grace, in light of this great graciousness that God has shown to us. It leaves us with this challenge. How do we in our setting and in our day give Jesus our best? Without, and here's where I think we degenerate very quickly, without becoming very legalistic, duty-driven, rules-oriented, feeling like God has His thumb on me if I don't do this. Because already I'm betting what's happened in some of your minds and hearts is you're ready to grab your wallet and to say, oh no, the preacher's going to talk to me about giving money. I know it. Listen, I'm not going to talk to you just about your money. I'm talking about your entire life. And how do we come to a place where we become people who don't just give God the leftovers, but we actually give Him the best? Well, there's a story that I think gives us an incredible picture of a better alternative than feeling like we are guilted into giving God more, and if we don't give God more, then He's not going to bless us, and if we don't give God more, He's going to be upset with us, and the preacher's going to be mean to us. If we don't give God more, I'm going to feel guilty. What we find in John chapter 12 is a healthy, refreshing alternative to this idea that we have to give God our best out of a sense of duty or guilt or compulsion. So if you'll open with me to John chapter 12, I want to show you a story. It takes place shortly after the time of Lazarus being raised from the grave. If you were here last week, Jason preached through John chapter 11, did an incredible job highlighting the story of Lazarus. In John chapter 12, we find John the writer picking up where he left off. In verse 1 of chapter 12, he says, Jesus, therefore, 6 days before the Passover. Now, the reason I've highlighted 6 days before the Passover is because John chapters 1 through 11 was a period of about 2 to 3 years. It covers much of Jesus' earthly ministry. John chapter 12, all the way through to the end of the book, covers 6 days. plus the ascension and resurrection. So what's happening from this point is there is a shift taking place in John's focus where he's talked about Jesus' general ministry to people, and now he's talking about Jesus' private ministry to individuals. So here's the key thing to note. This is 6 days before the Passover, which means this is 6 days before Jesus dies. And as we think about giving Jesus our best, we need to know from the beginning that this is 6 days before Jesus was going to give his best to the people. So we've already set a tone here in verse 1. Jesus is heading to the cross. He's making his way in 6 days to die. So 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they made him a supper there, and Martha was serving. Martha was a sister to Lazarus. She was the one, if you know much about Martha, we typically know her as a busybody. She was always active. She's the kind of people we love in the church because they get things done. Martha was serving, but Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him. Now, wouldn't this have been so strange to be sitting there with Lazarus, a guy who just a number of days prior to this was dead and in the grave? And I'm assuming at this point he is showered and he is fresh and all of the stench is gone from him. But there is Lazarus. Enter into this story a woman who does something that would have required an incredible amount of courage. A woman who is a female in this first century context who would have been intimidated in the presence of men to express herself. A woman who, if she had listened to what everybody else said that she was supposed to be doing, she would have just helped Martha with the serving. She would have been busy. I want you to see what a woman does to give her best to Jesus in verse 3. Mary then took a pound of very costly perfume of pure nard. I've got to ask, does nard sound appealing to anybody here? I know it doesn't. I know it. So we've got to define what nard is. Nard, this kind of perfume, is actually grown in the Himalayan mountains and would have, from this particular type of flower, it would have had to have been shipped in. And it was so valuable that people could use this. They might receive it as an inheritance. They could use it to barter or to exchange for goods. Some people would use it basically as their security deposit, or not their security deposit, but like their security, their retirement. They used it as a source of wealth that they had, and it represented for them something that they could go to in a time of need. So for Mary, this pure nard, which I just have to say to the Oilers here, I am certain was GMO-free. It was organic. It was holistic. It was therapeutic grade. It was everything that you would want your oils to be. So we can go on and move forward in the passage. I don't know that. The Bible doesn't say. I'm just kidding around for those of you who love oils. She takes this very costly oil. Judas tells us that it was worth 300 days' wages. So picture this. This woman comes into this setting with this costly little jar of oil that would have, in our day's currency, been worth $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. This was her retirement. This was her security. Here's what she does with it. She takes this perfume and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Mary could have taken this opportunity to say, Jesus, there's something I need from you. There's something I want from you. Mary could have taken this opportunity to say, Jesus, I want something from you. Mary uses this opportunity to give her best to Jesus. And what I want you to see about this is that she did not do this because she felt guilty. She did not do this because there was a law that had mandated she give a certain portion of this oil. She didn't do this because she had to do it. She did it because she saw something in Jesus that everybody else around her must have been missing. And when I read what Mary did right here, and you read the other accounts of how she broke open the jar, which essentially meant that she was going to give everything that she had to Jesus, I get this sense that there was something in Mary that I want in me. There was something in the heart of Mary that said, I'm not going to do this to impress the men around me. In fact, the men around me are going to think that I'm silly for doing this. I'm not going to do this to try to earn favor with Jesus. There's no way that I can earn favor with him. I'm not going to do this because I feel guilty or because I feel like I have to. I'm going to do this because I see something in Jesus that says I've just got to bring him the best that I have. And I don't know about you, but I know for me, there's something in Mary that I want. There's something of her heart that I see, I believe we would do well to have in our hearts. And so we see what Mary does. You would think, wouldn't you, that the disciples would say, man, I should have thought of that. I should have brought the precious thing that I had at my house, and I know we've got 6 days. Jesus has been talking about he's going to die and he's going to give himself up, and I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I know this. We don't have a whole lot of time with Jesus, so I need to make the most of this time. I need to bring my best. You would think that the disciples, the ones who had followed him, the men, would have stepped up and they would have led, but here's what happens. One of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, it says, was intending to betray Jesus, said, why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and given to poor people? And it wasn't just Judas. Matthew tells us in his account that the disciples, there must have been more than one. It says they became indignant when they saw Mary do this. Judas's real motives are revealed in verse 6 when it says, now he said this not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief, and as he had the money box, he used to pilfer what was put into it. Now, I'm guessing, wouldn't you, that Judas would have been okay if Mary had taken a little dab of the oil and maybe anointed Jesus' head. If Mary had done something more sensible, Judas probably would have been okay if Mary had given Jesus the leftovers because that would have made sense. But what Mary did made no sense to Judas at all. And it makes me wonder, what was the difference between Judas and Mary? I think the key difference is that Judas was missing something very important. And Judas did not see the bigger picture of what Jesus was going to accomplish. Judas was not aware that Jesus was about to give himself 6 days from now. Judas wasn't aware of what Jesus was doing and what he was giving. Several years ago, I used to umpire baseball and referee basketball, and umpiring baseball I found really quick was, in terms of efficiency, was not a great way to make money because baseball games last forever and they don't pay you much and people are not nice to you. But I did it because I was young and, I enjoyed part of it when I was younger, but I got to a stage where I was like, it's not very much fun. You go out and you're hot and you're sweaty and people are yelling at you and you're not making that much money. So in this season where I was refereeing, I got a call from a coach, and he said, hey, we need somebody to come out and referee. I don't know if it was a game or like in a tournament or whatever it was. I said, look, I'm really not interested in doing that. I'm not wanting to umpire right now. And so I said, I'm just not interested. He said, well, and he gives me the story, well, I can't find anybody else, and we really need somebody, and it would mean so much to me. And, he gives me this whole story. So I'm thinking, okay, I'll tell you what, you try to find somebody else, and if you can't find somebody else, then give me a call. Well, you know what's going to happen there. He probably waits around 30 minutes. I'm like, I'll give him a call again. So he calls me back later, and I told him, I said, I really don't want to do this, but I will do this as a favor to you. Now, already in this story, aren't you realizing who the hero is? I mean, I am. I'm realizing that in this whole story, at least this is my perception of how I saw it, I'm being so gracious and so generous that I'm going to go and I'm going to do this as a favor to this guy. And wouldn't you think that the entire game, the tournament, whatever it was, that any call that I would have made, the coach would have been like, that's the right call. Because he would see what I'm giving and what I'm doing. And that ain't what happened. The game starts going within the first 2 innings. The coach, he's up off the bench, he's out, he's yelling, he's screaming, and with every word he's saying, I just want to take my mask off and throw it and say, I quit! I go home. Because what was happening in me is there was a guy, at least from my perception, there was a guy who didn't realize what I was giving. I think Judas didn't realize what Jesus was giving. For some of you ladies, it may be that if you like to prepare a big meal, some of you men might like to do this. You prepare a big meal for your family and you go to the grocery store and you think about what each individual person wants and you're so excited to see them gather around the meal and you've worked and you've prepared and you've given and you've given and you've given and boy, they sit down and they consume. But before long, somebody says, oh, these mashed potatoes are too runny. You say, where's the pan that I prepared those mashed potatoes? Or this meat's too dry. What you would say to them is, don't you realize what I've given? Don't you realize what I've prepared? And all you can do is to come and complain. There's some of you who are teachers and coaches who you live this every day. You do things, extra hours, you go overboard, you spend time, and what you hear is not thanks, and I'm grateful for what you've done. What you hear is complaints. The reason is because people need to see a clear picture of what's being given and what's being done. And when we live in light of that picture of what's being given and what's being done, it totally transforms how we see the person. I think the difference between these two was that Mary had a picture of what Jesus had done, and Mary had a picture of what Jesus was going to do. In fact, we find in verse 7, Jesus responding to Lazarus and to everyone else who was gathered together that day. And he said to them, he said this, let her alone, so that she may keep this, notice, for the day of my burial. Both in Matthew and Mark, we find a clear implication that Mary was doing this because she was aware there was something bigger at stake. And I wrote down here what Mary had seen is that Mary saw Jesus as a man who had supernatural power to raise people from the dead. But Mary also saw Jesus as a man who had sacrificial passion to die on the cross and to go in the grave. What Mary saw in Jesus was a man who had this supernatural power, but he had this sacrificial passion. And so for us, what we, I believe, need to embrace about Jesus is this, that Jesus is more than just a historical figure. Jesus is more than a way to heaven. Jesus is more than a good teacher. Jesus is more than a friend you call on when you need help. Jesus is more than a way to get a clean conscience after a moral failure. Here's who Jesus is. Jesus is the one who chose the cross so you and I could stand before the throne. Jesus is the one who took a crown of thorns so you and I could take a crown of righteousness. Jesus is the one who died so you and I could live. Jesus is the one who left the eternal security of heaven so that you and I could have eternal security on earth. Jesus is the one who loves you even when you don't love yourself. Jesus is the one who defeated hell so hell would never defeat you. Jesus is the one who revealed God as a father to those who would see him as a taskmaster. Jesus is the one who ripped open the grave so you could stand with him in glory. Jesus is the one who sacrificed his precious blood so that the blood that now flows through your veins would speak these words: Son, daughter, child of the King, new, prized, redeemed, healed, spoken for, valued, righteous, overcomer. That is Jesus. Which of the two people do you think saw that? I can tell you it wasn't Judas. Because all Judas would have done is said, Jesus, you can have my leftovers. You can have what we don't use here, but Mary, she saw a clear picture of who Jesus was. And I'm just convinced of this. If there is one thing that happens in your heart, this awareness, this shift that takes place where we begin to see Jesus for who he is. Some kind of just historical figure who did good deeds, but we could see that he is the one who brought life into existence. He is the one who is this very moment, through his Spirit, aware of the words that I'm speaking and the words that you're hearing. He is the one this very minute, through his Spirit, who can speak to you through his word and change you. He is the one who is alive right now and who is inhabiting and indwelling everything that is taking place. He is the one who is giving life to your lungs right now. The very breath and the air that you're breathing is being given to you by Jesus. That is who Jesus is. Now, when we begin to see Him, we don't worry as much about the cost of the sacrifice because we know that the one who is receiving that sacrifice is vastly greater than whatever the cost of the sacrifice is. Here's the central truth that I want you to grasp from this passage today. You give your best to Jesus because Jesus gave His best to you. You mind if I'm real straightforward for just a minute? Some of us in this room, we need to repent from coming before Jesus and saying, Jesus, right now, my life is really busy, my finances are really hectic, things are really rough, so you can have whatever it is that I have left over at the end of the week. If it means that I'm able to show up on a Sunday and give you my worship and offer this to you, then Jesus, you can have that part of my leftovers. Jesus is worthy of more than our leftovers. So for us on our part, the way that we need to respond to this story, this refreshing alternative to living this guilt-driven, duty-ridden life where we feel like God is just trying to wring out all of the good from us, but we realize, no. God is the very source of all good, and Jesus, His Son, is the perfect representation of everything that is good. And so we give in response to what Jesus has given to us. That's the difference between grace and guilt. And the big shift that needs to happen in some of your hearts is you are a person who you're motivated and driven by guilt, and I've got to do this for God, and if not, He's going to be disappointed. You need to begin giving out of grace. Not so that God will love you more, but because God already loves you. Not so that God will give you more blessings, but because God already has blessed you. You need to begin giving out of grace of what God has already done, not just so that He can do more. And so here are some shifts that can happen in our lives. When we see the worth of Jesus, here are some changes that will take place in us. The first is that in terms of our priorities, when we see Jesus as the most worthy, valuable thing in our priorities, this gives order to everything else in your life. Mary was able to make this decision and to go against the grain and to step into an environment that would have been very intimidating for a woman and do something that would have drawn attention to her that she would not have wanted because she knew what was most important. In terms of her priorities, hear me, Jesus gave everything else order in her life. Modern day illustration I read recently in a book about a guy named Tom Seaver. For those of you baseball folks, you know he's a Hall of Fame pitcher, retired back in the 80s, and he was dominant in the 70s and 80s. Over 3,600 strikeouts, 300 wins, was inducted into the Hall of Fame. Tom Seaver had something that gave his entire life order. It was the thing around which his entire life was built, and he talks about it when he says this. He says, pitching determines what I eat, when I go to bed. And can you imagine if we were to insert Jesus into this? Pitching determines what I eat, when I go to bed, what I do when I'm awake. It determines how I spend my life when I'm not pitching. If it means I have to come to Florida and can't get tan because I might get a burn that would keep me from throwing for a few days, then I never go shirtless in the sun. If it means I have to remind myself to pet dogs with my left hand or throw logs on the fire with my left hand, then I do that too. It means in the winter I eat cottage cheese instead of chocolate chip cookies in order to keep my weight down, then I eat cottage cheese. I think if a dude can do that for baseball, I think Jesus is worthy. So this changes us in terms of our priorities. The second thing that it does for us when we see the worth of Jesus is that in terms of our money, it frees us to express radical generosity. Now, I know this. Every week, I'm not expecting somebody to break open their bank account and give $30,000. I realize that. But we cannot walk away from this story with the awareness that what happened in Mary's heart, seeing the worth of Jesus, led her to say, there is no price too great to offer to my master. And the frank truth is that many people here, you think that you are proud of yourself if all Jesus gets are your leftovers. And hear my heart, I'm not trying to be mean or fussy. I'm just trying to say to you that if you're at a place this morning and you're not in terms of your finances reveal your heart. They reveal what you value. And in terms of what you use in your life with regard to your money, if Jesus doesn't have any of that, if you've said, no, that's not what he's going to get, and maybe he'll get a $10 bill or a $20 bill or whatever I have left over, I just want to push back and challenge you to say, I believe Jesus wants more than your leftovers. I believe that he wants the best that you have to offer. And again, we don't do that, we don't give that out of a sense of guilt. If what you hear right now is, oh gosh, I know, I need to be giving more, you're missing the point. The point is when you see how worthy Jesus is, you say, I want to get on board with helping other people see how worthy Jesus is. And if the money that God has given me is a means that God uses to advance that, then count me in. That's the heart I believe God wants for people when it comes to giving. He doesn't want stubborn spirits that have to be convinced through duty and compulsion. He wants people to say, oh, Jesus is so good. Yes, I'll give. And I pray for that today. I pray that for you. I pray that for me. I pray that for all of us. That's the heart that we give with. This affects us when we see the worth of Jesus in terms of our worship. You want to see a picture of worship on display? Mary offers us a powerful picture. This frees us to worship without regard to what others think or say. Can you imagine with me for just a moment if it were to happen in your heart when you come in here on a Sunday morning? And the band starts up the music and you hear a song that, yeah, I kind of like that song and man, the words resonate with me. I just want to focus on God for just a minute. And then you start focusing on God and you think, gosh, I would really just love to be expressive right now. And I would love to raise my hands or fall to my knees. I would like to do something just to express to God as if it was just us and nobody else was around. If it was just God and me and I was before the throne, wouldn't it be an empowering listen to me, an empowering, life-changing thing if you could come to Jesus as if nobody else was around? Well, that's what Mary did. All Mary received from the men in the room would have been scorn. Jealousy. How could she do that? And I just pray, to God right now for a church with a heart full of, that just says, I want more than anything else. I want Jesus. I want to see his worth. And if people think that I'm a little strange or a little off, well then so be it. But I know Jesus knows me and Jesus knows my heart. And if it means that I look a little odd or look a little strange because I am free in front of the throne before Jesus, so be it. I think people who come in here every week, they see people who are passionately pursuing Jesus in worship. It's going to open up our eyes and say, my goodness, what has gotten into them? It's compelling and it's attractive. So when we see the worth of Jesus, it affects and changes our worship. When we see the worth of Jesus, it changes us in how we utilize our time. It frees us to value what matters most. Mary, this day, could have been preoccupied with so many things. She could have been distracted. She could have been busy. She could have been tending to people. She could have been doing all kinds of things. She could have just given Jesus her leftovers. And when the meal was finished, when everybody had gotten done oohing and awing over Lazarus, when all that was done, as Jesus was parting, she could say, Jesus, let me give you a few minutes of my attention. Jesus could have done what is the temptation for us in our day, and it is to give everything else our best through the entire week. And then when Sunday rolls around, say, Jesus, do I have anything left in the tank for you, or am I too tired from everything else that I've been doing? Well, I've got a little bit left in the tank, so I'll give you my Sunday. I want to say this with as much love as I possibly can. Jesus doesn't need your leftovers. He doesn't need our leftovers, what we have left at the end of the week. I believe this, that Jesus deserves, He's worthy of, and He desires our best. Can you imagine with me if there was a culture shift that I believe can take place but would require the power of God, where people began to see Sunday as the centerpiece of their entire week, and they began to schedule and orient everything in their life around common worship with the church of Jesus? Can you imagine with me if believers in Jesus said, we're not going to follow the mode of culture and bow down to everything else that culture says we should be doing on Sundays, and if they just said, on Sunday, we are giving our best to Jesus? Can you just imagine with me what would happen? I believe it would be powerful. The last thing that this does is, when we see the worth and the value of Jesus, is it frees us up to show others how much Jesus is worth. The ending of this story, recounted by Matthew and Mark, is that Jesus said, wherever the good news is preached, what this woman has done will be told in memory of her. Everywhere Jesus went from this point over the next 6 days, when Jesus walked down an alley, as He walked by people, they would have sensed an aroma coming from Jesus. They would have sensed this aroma and wondering, what is different about this man? Why does he have this expensive perfume? They would have sensed something different about him. When we have in our hearts a value of the worth of Jesus, can you imagine what's going to happen in your homes, in your workplaces, in your schools, when you go in and you bring a different aroma and awareness that Jesus is the one who is worthy of all? He's more valuable than anything else. Can you imagine what's going to happen when you are the kind of person who brings your best every day to your job, every day to your family? You bring your best to Jesus, and it infects and influences everything else, every part of your life. It's going to change your witness. And it's not going to be the kind of witness where you're guilted into, if I don't say this, I'm going to be in trouble. No. You see the worth and the value of Jesus, and it flows from you the way it flowed from Mary. Folks, I want to tell you, I love you today. I believe Jesus loves you today. He's worthy of our best. Let's pray. Father, I thank you this morning for Jesus. I thank you that in this story of Mary, we get a picture of just open and radical, free giving, free worship.